Do you regard yourself as a bigot? Do you think the United States was stolen from Native Americans or that it was rightfully colonized by Europeans? Have you ever rolled up your car windows in a predominantly minority neighborhood? Have you ever rolled up your car windows in a predominantly poor white neighborhood? After that, there's a list of 18 religious and or ethnic groups, and then 8 or so questions with response choices that must be matched using one of these ethnic or religious groups: Irish American, Hispanic American, Japanese American, Vietnamese American, Italian American, African American, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and on and on and on. German Americans, etc., etc. Now get a load of the questions. Which of the above do you think is responsible for the decline of the U.S. economy? You have to choose from one of these groups. Which of the above do you think is more likely to raise a large family? Would you ever associate with someone of the same sex who was either rumored or a self-declared homosexual? Why or why not? Which of the above do you think is most subject to criminal activity? Which of the above do you think would be most likely to eliminate an entire race? Who has most influenced the way you feel about other races? Write down the person, mother, dad, whatever. If you could eliminate an entire race, would you? And if yes, which one? Yes. People should have started sitting up and taking notice right then. Remember, it's not a matter of 1 or 2 questions, standing in isolation, but the totality of all this psychologizing taken together that fuels the social chaos and which permits government to compile personality profiles. So far, I've only described assessments you might hear about. School counselors and teachers, unlicensed to disseminate clinical questionnaires, increasingly are being asked to do so by university researchers, for example, in order to avoid public scrutiny. In a half-hearted attempt to protect the public, the American Psychological Association published a text entitled Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. Using this reference text, companies like Psychological Assessment Resources, or PAR, established policy guidelines supposedly to restrict access to these test materials. PAR's catalog contains attitude and behavioral scales that are rated as level A, B, or C, with C being the most restricted, requiring a graduate degree in clinical psychology. But all you have to do is dial PAR's 800 number. Tell the salesperson you're a high school psychology teacher, and presto, you can order some restricted personality tests for your classroom. Or use the name of a licensed psychologist, and you can get such C-level products as Personality Assessment Inventory, the State Straight Depression Adjective Checklist, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. The B-level questionnaires are even more accessible. These include Emotional Problem Scale, the Reynolds Child Depression Scale, and the Defense Mechanisms Inventory. Some A-level items like Adolescent Coping and Depression Course and Mental Status Checklist for Children and Adolescents abound in teachers' classrooms. Well, you get the picture. The psychological probing never stops. An equally significant point, however, is that all these various assessments, in whatever form they come, are tagged, or slugged, as it's called, for identification. I describe all the different hidden types of hidden identifiers in my book and hidden identification techniques. These assessments are exempted for the most part from Freedom of Information laws, which means that the only way parents can see one is if someone slips it out surreptitiously. The interpretive literature that explains most of these assessments and the curriculums that inevitably follow is equally hard to obtain without authorization or the correct computer codes. But when you do find them, you discover what the testers are really looking for. In Pennsylvania, it was for the following. What is the child's locus of control? Does the child willingly receive stimuli? Will the child conform to group goals? Is the child amenable to change? Is the child intrinsically or externally motivated? And will the child respond to authority figures? Where's the academics? There isn't any. If you homeschool your children, you're no longer exempt. Many states are requiring a so-called proficiency test for youngsters to graduate regardless of how they're schooled. What the tests reveal is not so much the cognitive level attained by the student as to the extent to which the curriculums aimed at shaping worldviews and opinions have been internalized, as the educators say. That's why, and you may have seen the recent news stories about this, homeschool students now have to score higher on the SATs than state-schooled children. Yeah. Private schools are no longer exempt either, especially if they accept state funds. For example, a lady by the name of J.D. Hoy, who came out of the Department of Education's Northwest Regional Laboratory, that's one of the federal government's labs and centers, there's I think 10 of them around the country. Prior to being tapped for President Clinton's National School to Work office, she was interviewed for a publication called Northwest Policy, and she asserted that our issue is that it's for all kids, and all means all. All does not mean some. When the interviewer asked about the youngsters who were not in state schools, Ms. Hoy said, "Most of those kids we've got through other agencies, adult and family services, teen parent programs, corrections programs, and other alternate learning programs. We're serious. All means all." She also confirmed that the SAT and state assessments were emphasizing teamwork, which means cooperative learning, and so-called critical thinking, which actually means forming opinions based on little or no hard information. Hoy confirmed that assessment responses were going into electronic portfolios and from there directly into the workplace. What's not so well understood by activists like yourself, much less the typical parent, is what is pulling this fraudulent testing, the expanded psychological assessment process, and non-cognitive curriculums together. And this is what I found out. It's called predictive technology. Predictive technology is the glue that holds testing, curriculum, and workforce planning together. Predictive technology. It means the capability, using a mathematical computer model, of taking information from many sources and predicting what a person will do in the future, given this or that situation, this or that political candidate, or this or that advertising campaign. I think you see where we're going with this. Two things that spurred me to write Cloning of the American Mind were the dual news items concerning Filegate and the White House office database. At the time these particular Clinton administration scandals broke, the news commentators were reporting them as separate, non-connected stories. You remember them, Filegate, in which some 900 Reagan-Bush-era personnel files from the FBI wound up in the White House, and simultaneously the discovery of a White House office database which White House staffers nicknamed Big Brother, ostensibly used by the Clintonites to keep a social and fundraising registry. But one little piece of information that no one seemed to pick up on stood out for me. Data from the FBI files reportedly included information predicting which causes each person in those FBI files might support and what he or she might want from a future administration down the road. Now, I had a top secret clearance when I worked for the director of Voice of America, and I can tell you they don't ask questions like that for security clearances. Yes, the FBI may interview friends, acquaintances, and former employers about your past affiliations and behavior, but long-term predictions, that's another matter. The only way that kind of information can be generated with any degree of accuracy is to access a number of computers and analyze all the data together and crunch the numbers, essentially. The technique used to do this is called psychographics. Psychographics. The term psychographics has been around a while, but it's a word most people aren't familiar with. It was created for use in advertising to target a market for a product. Then it was used in political campaigns to target a demographic group for political advertising, like the Rust Belt, the Bible Belt, and that kind of a thing. Today, it's part and parcel of school assessment and surveying processes, making it easier to target kids for indoctrination through non-cognitive curriculums. That's those psychologized curriculums. When we examine Webster's New World Communication and Media Dictionary, and that's what advertisers use, we find that psychographics means, quote, the study of social class based upon demographics, income, race, color, religion, and personality traits. Race and religion? These are characteristics, says the dictionary, which can be measured to predict behavior. There you have it. With the 1970s, behavioral scientists assumed complete control of education, leaving real educators, the scholars, out in the cold. Although most of the behaviorists who did the original damage resided outside the United States, and I go to great pains in my book to describe each of these people, their students and disciples found safe havens and fertile fields among America's tax-exempt foundations, working alongside government through grants and contracts. The kind of education they were interested in is the one that determines what average citizens like you and me think about and for how long. Experts in the field call this the science of coercion. The science of coercion. Now, what all this means is that molding public opinion is suddenly much easier and can begin much earlier with school children.